Well, good evening. My name is Michael C. Hardy, and for the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about food and the Army of Northern Virginia, particularly related to the Battle of Gettysburg. But before we get into Gettysburg, we're going to back up just a little bit, and we're going to look at Robert E. Lee's first campaign, where he crosses the Potomac River in September of 1862, the Maryland campaign. And the campaign was not really a success. It was actually an abysmal failure. The Confederates had some success at Harper's Ferry and Shepherdstown, but they had been fought to a draw by the Army of the Potomac at Sharpsburg in September, and then they retreated. They had this policy of being patient with the populace. They were attempting to entice Marylanders to support the Confederacy with troops and with foodstuffs, and that policy failed. And certainly some of Lee's men must have been wondering as they crossed the Potomac again into Maryland in June of 1863. Is this policy, is what we did before going to have an effect on the battle, on the war? An assistant surgeon of the 13th South Carolina would write on June 28th, quote, "Last year when invading Maryland, we were almost starved," end quote. Without that big stockpile of supplies that the Maryland campaign should have produced, the winter months of 62 and 1863 were lean times for Lee's armies. Foodstuffs were being shipped from much further south following the Battle of Fredericksburg. It took time to get there. The railroads were in rough shape. Rolling stock was in rough shape. And Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, and Confederate Commissary General Lucius Northrop feuded throughout the winter months. Lee wanted a lot of the stockpile in Richmond sent to his very hungry army, while at the same time, Northrop wanted Lee's wagons and cavalry detail to be turned over to the commissary department and to scour the countryside, not necessarily to feed Lee's army, but to increase the stockpiles in Richmond. So there is this constant back and forth between Lee's army and Northrop in Richmond and the War Department in Richmond. In mid-February of 1863, Lee sends portions of James Longstreet's corps to the Norfolk area. Part of their mission was to gather supplies for the army, and it's an attempt to kind of deal with that problem. Lee would have less men to feed, while Longstreet would be gathering supplies for his own men and some for Lee's army in the greater Fredericksburg area. Interesting quote. Some of this banter between the Confederate soldiers and the Federal soldiers along the Rappahannock line. A Federal soldier would say that we've heard that you have a new general over there, talking to the Confederates, and the Confederates would say, "Well, we don't have any new generals. Who are you talking about?" And the Federal response was that the new general was General Starvation. And Lee's men are really hungry at this point in time. In April of 1863, the food situation starts to improve. Besides their meager rations and what the soldiers were to receive in boxes from home, squads of men are sent out to procure wild onions, poke sprouts, sassafras buds, watercress, all to supplement the few things that are arriving, and they're trying to prevent scurvy in the army. Scurvy is start to appear, and the Federal soldiers are noticing it. The Confederate doctors are reporting it. But what the Confederates start to do is they start to fish. The shad start running in the Rappahannock River and the tributaries in that area. Lafayette McLaws, Confederate general, would write, "Our men not only fish in the river, but seine it, catching hundreds of fish at a time. And it's not just McClaw's division that is doing that. It is just about every Confederate soldier in that area. A member of the 28th North Carolina wrote that his men were catching hundreds of shad every day, while the brigades of Dole and Colquitt had established fisheries near their camp. So they are building fish traps. They are using large nets to bring in an abundance of fish, which greatly improve their diet. The Battle of Chancellorsville helps a little bit as well. The federal soldiers, when they start to cross over the river and fight the Battle of Chancellorsville, have about 8 days worth of rations on their person, in their haversacks, in their knapsacks. And many Confederate soldiers, after the battle, write of picking up coffee, sugar, vegetables, meat, salt, crackers, and they are able to supplement their diet as well. Lee knows that he needs to give the war-ravaged Virginia countryside a rest from the contending armies. British military observer Colonel Arthur Fremantle noted in June 1863 that large parts of the state were now completely cleaned out. He would write, "It is almost uncultivated, and no animals are grazing where there used to be hundreds." A movement north across the Potomac River should force the Federals to follow, allowing the farmers to plant crops. Plus, Maryland and Pennsylvania could supply the Confederates with not only foodstuffs for immediate consumption, but foodstuffs for months ahead, along with horses, fodder, horseshoes, and many other needed items. Parts of the Army of Northern Virginia were on the march in early June. Typically, a soldier would carry rations for a day or two in his haversack, while unused rations were stored in the division trains. During the first part of the march away from Fredericksburg, one staff officer in Stewart's brigade wrote that they not only had no rations, but those in charge would, quote, put a fellow in the guardhouse now for taking a drink of water. And as to eating, that is out of the question, end quote. Culpeper became a staging area for the movement further north. As the railroad brought supplies into town, on June 8th, for those near Culpeper, orders came to prepare rations. One member of the 53rd Virginia wrote of cooking 4 days' worth of food, while another 10 days were stored in the commissary wagons. A soldier in the 3rd Alabama chronicled that it took all night to prepare the food. "My haversack," he wrote, "is now full of biscuits and ham." The soldiers also had, at that time, honey and milk. It seemed that in Culpeper area, soldiers had a chance to purchase or forage for additional foodstuffs from local citizens. The staff officer in Stewart's brigade, we mentioned a moment ago, wrote of trading a pound of sugar for butter and buttermilk. They then dined on toasted bread and black-eyed peas with fried ham. Being on the move did prove challenging. Near the Brandy Station battlefield, a corporal in the 5th Alabama recalled being issued rations on the night of June 10th. By, he wrote, the time we got our dough made up, we were ordered off and gave up our rations to be hauled. They moved another 10 or 12 miles, went into camp, and waited for the commissary wagon to arrive. When the teamsters finally appeared, the Alabamians discovered that their allotment of dough had been lost or thrown away. For the advance elements of the Army under Ewell, not only were there opportunities to trade or purchase supplies from sympathetic civilians, but there was always a chance to procure supplies from the enemy. On the capture of Berryville, one Confederate soldier wrote that the Federal soldiers had left quickly, leaving pots, he wrote, full of edibles that were still on the fire when we got to camp. After eating, these Tar Heels filled their haversacks and pushed on. The plunder at Martinsville was just as rich, although the Federals did try and set fire to the supplies left behind. What was left amounted to 6,000 bushels of grain, along with haversack stuffers, such as, quote, as much butter and sugar and coffee as I wanted, reported one member of the 4th Georgia. At Williamsport, Confederate forces gathered commissary stores and foodstuffs, while Jenkins' cavalry took several hundred head of cattle. With the main body, as each company came into Culpeper's, the main body of the Confederate Army, they were able to draw rations for the next leg of the journey. A South Carolina soldier noted on leaving the town that each soldier had to have a canteen full of water. No one was allowed to leave the ranks to refill as the army pushed north. As a soldier in the 26th North Carolina told those back at home that the men, they had plenty to eat on June 21st. They drew flour every evening and spent a good portion of the night preparing their meals for the next day. Likewise, a member of the 13th South Carolina wrote of having plenty of meat and bread along with milk acquired at Front Royal. As the army splashed across the Potomac River, moving past Sharpsburg, they entered a country little affected by the hard hand of war. Quote, "We are now in the most splendid country I ever saw, everything in the way of sustenance being in the most profuse abundance." That was Major Charles Blacknall, 23rd North Carolina. He was writing from Greencastle, Pennsylvania on June 23rd. He continued, "Our army is being amply and abundantly supplied from this country, and we cannot consume 1/10 of the supplies before or around us. Wheat, corn, oats, clover, beef, bacon, butter, etc., being in waste on all sides." 2 days earlier, General Lee had issued an order concerning the gathering of supplies while on campaign. Only certain officers were allowed to make requisitions from the local populace, and items had to be paid for either in Confederate cash or in vouchers to be paid after the war. A later order told the troops in the Army of Northern Virginia that any soldier caught abusing private property would be arrested and punished. General Richard Ewell went as far as prohibiting his men from forcing Confederate money on the civilian population. Instead, they had to use federal currency. Yet even stern orders from Generals Lee and Ewell could not keep the hungry Confederate soldiers from the bounty they observed as they trudged along. Some soldiers tried to pay for their foodstuffs they sought. Near Greencastle, one member of the 53rd North Carolina at first struck out trying to find food at a home. Finally, he was able to get, quote, ear of one of the two ladies, and after proving to them that we were not wild animals nor thieves, they gave us what we wanted, but would not take pay for anything, end quote. An officer in the 12th Alabama ate breakfast with a citizen near Chambersburg, but the citizen refused payment, although the captain assured him that the Confederate money would soon take the place of greenbacks. Yet not all Johnny Rebs were as honest. A member of the 9th Alabama Infantry near Fayette, Pennsylvania, wrote of his comrades capturing chickens. Quote, "I would not punish one of them, for as Joe McMurray says, it's not half as bad as they did to his mothers and sisters in Alabama." End quote. Major General William Dorsey Pender, commanding the Light Division, had the same perspective as the Alabama officer. His troops had behaved well until they crossed over into Maryland, but once across the Potomac, it was hard to restrain them. His men took, quote, "poultry and hogs, but in most cases pay our money for it," end quote. The Confederate actions were tame compared to what the Federals had done in Virginia, Pender's men believed. Some believe that Lee's order would have a positive effect on the men. Lieutenant Iowa Michigan Royster, 37th North Carolina, wrote from Chambersburg on June 29th, quote, "Yesterday and the day before our soldiers plundered far and wide, taking buttermilk, apple butter, fruit, chicken, pigs, and horses, and everything they could lay their hands on. The people are frightened out of their senses. 'Take anything you want, but don't hurt us,' is their cry. They are afraid to protest against anything. It is the most beautiful country you ever saw. The neatest farms, fine houses, good fences. The whole country is covered with the finest crops of wheat. Such wheat is not seen in our country. Yesterday, however, General Lee sent an order around that all stealing and plunder should be punished, in each case with death. That officers should be held accountable for the execution of his orders. The plundering will be stopped now." End quote. Parts of the Army rested on June 28th, with Ewell's Corps working their way toward York. Ewell's men gathered large quantities of supplies as they moved north of the main army. Jubal Early's division found 2,000 rations in a train at Gettysburg on June 28th and distributed them to his men before burning the cars. In York, the Confederates demanded shoes, hats, cash, and enough supplies to feed his division for 3 days. The townspeople complied, and part of the cash was used to purchase cattle from local farmers. Robert Rhodes's division arrived in Carlisle on June 27th. He was able to collect both food to feed his army and able to send additional foodstuffs back to Virginia. Quote, every field here is groaning under the burden of immense crops, which we are in hopes to eat, one Tar Heel doctor wrote about his stay in Carlisle. We enjoy this rich valley. Buttermilk, etc., are plenty, and we are find luxuries in them. He recalled after the war that, quote, we went into camp every day at 5 or 6 o'clock, and my knapsack bearer always had a few fat hens at his griddle, and we enjoyed a chicken stew, some good Pennsylvania butter and bread, and I believe some real coffee, end quote. While Lee and Ewell might have issued orders against plundering, it still took place frequently. A member of the 3rd South Carolina wrote that his fellow comrades, quote, seemed to harbor a terrific spirit of revenge and steal and pillage in the most sinful manner. They take poultry and hogs and vegetables, fruit, honey, and any and everything they can lay their hands upon. Last night, Wofford's brigade of this division stole so much that they could not carry what rations they drew from the commissary. At York, a soldier in the 31st Virginia echoed the South Carolina soldier. The soldier recalled after the war that when his regiment arrived in camp late in the evening, he was ordered to go with another soldier to the commissary to draw rations for his company. They returned with, quote, 2 hindquarters of very fine beef, a barrel or 2 of flour, some buckets of wine and sugar, all for 20 men. End quote. Yet they struggled to awake their slumbering comrades. The next morning, as they set out for Gettysburg, the men paid no attention to the rations that had been issued to them because they already had so many things stuffed on their persons, and they marched away, leaving the rest of it for whoever might come next. The rest of Early's division probably fared the same, that Georgia soldier believed. On the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Army of Northern Virginia was well fed. They might have been better fed than at any other time during the war. It was a marked contrast to the previous campaigns of Antietam and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Bountiful issued rations coupled with food purchased or plundered from the countryside undoubtedly improved morale, which had been mostly high since the Confederate victory back in May at Chancellorsville. Combat always brought a disruption to foodstuffs. Soldiers who were often enduring their ordeals of battle needed an increase of caloric intake, yet commissary wagons were kept well to the rear. Miles often separated the men and their rations, their cooking apparatus, and even their cooks. In April of 1862, the Confederate government passed a law allowing each company to employ 4 cooks. An officer's mess might also have a cook. These cooks were often enslaved men, sometimes brought from home, but just as often hired someplace along the way. And at times, they were freedmen as well. An untold number of these cooks followed Lee's army north into Pennsylvania. They mostly remained with the wagon train following various divisions. Of course, not all soldiers chose to employ or use a cook. Many cooked for themselves or in small messes. About daylight on July 1st, the Battle of Gettysburg opened. Combat continued to build throughout the day as the Confederate and Federals fed more men into the action. At the end of the day, the Confederate forces has pushed the Federals through the town and into a defensive position along a ridge and series of hills just south of Gettysburg. Water was scarce throughout the day. James Green of the 53rd North Carolina wrote in his diary that his fellow soldiers had been without water from 10 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. It was hot, and the men had no time to stop and refill their canteens as they moved at the double quick across the field. At the end of the day, Lieutenant Channing M. Bolton, serving as an engineer on General Pender's staff, took 2 men and headed to the rear to find rations, probably for Pender and the rest of his staff members. A fellow Virginian, Copeland Page of the Amherst Artillery, found his camp servant Pete. Pete had built a fire and had scavenged 4 haversacks from dead Federals in the railroad cut. Copeland Page wrote, quote, "By 8 o'clock, my mess was filled with real coffee and other substantials, thanks to God in a double sense for the death of the Yankees." End quote. It was a little better for the troops coming up. Members of Kershaw's brigade went into camp that night a mile from town. A member of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry wrote, "As we had nothing to cook, no fires were lighted, so we laid down and slept." Few had anything in their haversacks, and so there was precious little breakfast for us that morning, that soldier continued. Kershaw's brigade continued to the front. They passed a brigade near the seminary cooking breakfast. So obviously somebody had rations at some point. With any lull in the fighting or with those posted behind the lines, soldiers took to searching for foodstuffs. The assistant surgeon of the 3rd North Carolina stumbled upon a spring house full of milk and cream. He paid $2 for the dairy products and set his ambulance crew to work churning. He also found a crock of marmalade, and since there were no rations, turned that into a meal. A group of Louisiana soldiers later in the day arrived and ransacked that very house, even taking a hive of bees. The doctor recalled the Louisianans taking the hive between 2 of them, marching straight through a bivouac of men, the infuriated bees flying in every direction. After the bees had quit the hive, the plunderers sat down and destroyed the honey. A member of the Stonewall Brigade wrote after the war that on the 2nd day of the battle, he and his comrades were rather short of rations. They visited neighboring farmhouses, finding spring houses with milk, butter, and apple butter and barrels of flour, a smokehouse full of bacon. They built a fire in the stove and commenced cooking chickens and baking bread. Quote, "We told the boys in the regiment about it, and some of them came over and cooked their rations and carried them back for others." End quote. Also writing after the war, a member of the 17th Georgia recalled finding a barrel of brandy while traveling to the battlefield. He and his comrades filled their canteens, but as the day grew warmer, regretted the lack of water. They eventually drank out of a muddy puddle in a ditch. Fighting lasted throughout the day and into the evening hours of July 2nd. Whereas July 1st was a Confederate victory, July 2nd was a draw. The Confederates had made some gains, but in other places like Little Round Top were unable to push the Federals out. It was not just the rank and file that were struggling to find food while the battle raged. A member of James Longstreet's staff, Moxley Sorrell, found an abandoned farmhouse on the morning of July 3rd. The owners were driven off by artillery fire the day before, and Sorrell found the house full of food. He breakfasted on bread and apple butter. A federal prisoner heading to the rear noted passing, quote, long lines of Negro cooks baking corn pone for rebel soldiers at the front, end quote. One of those cooks might have been Uncle John Price. He brought provisions to one company to the 4th Texas on the Confederate right that morning, laying the food on a flat rock. The Texans were still under fire. The lieutenant of the company yelled from behind a rock to Corporal Val Giles. He yelled, quote, "Sergeant Norris always issued the rations to the men, but poor Mose is dead now, and you must take his place. I appoint you second sergeant of the company. Divide the rations into 14 equal parts and have the men crawl up and get them," end quote. Under fire from the Federals, Giles crawled up and, quote, moved to the camp kettle of boiled roasting ears and a meal of sack of ironclad biscuits that Uncle John had brought in and began dividing the grub and laying it on top of a big flat rock, end quote. With many balls flying around, Giles finished dividing the food, and the remaining members of the company crawled toward the makeshift lunch counter. The fight on July 3rd, including the charge of 3 Confederate divisions across an open field and the attempts by Confederate cavalry to drive into the rear of the Confederate lines, were complete failures. Lee started to consolidate his lines along Oak and Seminary ridges and were prepared to withdraw from the field. Lee's position was not sustainable. Writing about 2 weeks after the battle, a member of the Rowan artillery recognized just that. Quote, "There was nothing to prevent our holding the position we occupied, but the simple fact that we were subsisting on the enemy's country, and the supply in the vicinity of our army was nearly all consumed." End quote. There were 2 options available, this Tar Heel believed. Supplies, like food and ammunition, could be brought to them, or, as he wrote, we could go to the supplies. The first option he deemed impracticable. Quote, "Our communication was cut off and could only be reopened by force," he wrote. Necessity forced the Army of Northern Virginia to go to the supplies. There seems to have been some effort on the part of the Confederate High Command to provision the troops on July 4th. Tar Heel did note that he was ordered to prepare 2 days of rations to stow in his haversack that day. But the massive wagon trains full of commissary supplies, coupled with droves of cattle, had moved out long before. The only thing left were long lines of wagons and ambulances bearing the wounded who could be moved. They started for Virginia. By July 6th, those rations that had been ordered had run out. Lieutenant Channing Bolton noted that he had swapped haversacks with a dead Federal. His bounty included hardtack, apple butter, and about half a pound of a side of bacon. He ate the bacon raw. Members of the 1st Georgia Sharpshooter Battalion, the 5th Alabama Infantry, and members of Ewell's staff all noted that their rations gave out on July 6th. Members of the 5th Alabama found some beef bones left by members of Ramsier's brigade, which they boiled into a soup. When the commissary wagons caught up with them that evening, they found little, and 3 or 4 men from each company were sent out to forage. One group returned with only flour, but another member of the company returned with 3 chickens. Ewell sent out a member of his staff with several from his courier company. They found a smokehouse, and over the loud protest of the owner, took 50 or 60 pounds of sausage, bacon, and flour. The staff officer confessed that, quote, he had never been so abused in his life as by that old woman, end quote. Most of the foodstuffs consumed by the weary Confederates over the next few days seemed to have been plundered from the countryside. From Hagerstown on July 8th, a member of the 3rd Alabama recalled, quote, "Good times. We had molasses, whiskey, chickens, butter, eggs, and so on. We let them find out how the war was going on, for they had never known it before. We just swept the country as we went on horses, cattle, hogs, chickens, and everything else." While they were having good times, the soldier also thought their actions were wrong. Soldiers in the van, as we already stated, fared better than those who came behind. On July 9th, a Texan wrote that he was soaking wet, without meat, and with little bread, and have been for some times. As the Confederates neared the Potomac River, they discovered not only their pontoon bridge destroyed, but the river swollen with the recent rains. The army was trapped. Assistant Surgeon Thomas Wood of the 3rd North Carolina noted that only ordnance wagons were allowed from the south side of the river. Their enterprising brigade commissary found an ordnance wagon, loaded it with rations, and crossed the river for his men. Other commands remained hungry. Quote, "We are out of rations. Some of our men have not had bread in 48 hours. Our foraging in the country is cut off," wrote an officer of the 28th North Carolina in a letter home on July 13th. In Hagerstown, Engineering Lieutenant Bolton recalled their flour giving out while he was constructing the new pontoon boats. He was ordered to search houses in the neighborhood, giving a receipt when edibles were found and taken. A lady at one house told him that if he attempted to search her home, she would shoot him. Bolton ordered his men to search the house anyway, and while no one was shot, his soldiers were met with, quote, "volumes of curses," end quote, but no food. They did eventually find enough to provision themselves with butter, apple butter, honey, milk, and cream. As they finished breakfast, a farmer appeared at the tent, complaining that his spring house had been broken into. Bolton's commanding officer promised to look into the matter and punish the culprit, but that story ends there. Lee was finally able to get his army across the river on the evening of July 13th, and the Gettysburg campaign shuddered to a close. While the Battle of Gettysburg is considered a defeat for the Confederate Army, Lee's strategy achieved some important goals that prolonged the war. The Federals had been enticed away from central Virginia. Lee's troops had gathered adequate supplies to sustain them for months, and the men of the Army of Northern Virginia had provisioned themselves from the countryside for much of the campaign. While some members of Lee's command might have taken the noble and heroic moral high ground by following his orders regarding interactions with the civilian population, many others clearly found the rich countryside too much to bear and took orders from only their hungry stomachs. Of course, the war goes on after Gettysburg for a number of months, even though the armies are inactive for much of the rest of 1863. You could throw Mine Run and the Bristow campaign in there, but they don't amount to much. And really until May of 1864. After May of 1864, you have many different campaigns going on. You have Hunter and Sheridan that are moving down the Shenandoah Valley, wiping out foodstuffs. And you've got Sherman's campaign that are destroying railroads in Georgia where foodstuffs cannot be sent from that area as well. It's really, as we get into late 1864, it comes to the port of Wilmington and the Cape Fear River where the vast majority of supplies for the Confederate Army, especially foodstuffs, are being shipped in. Some of those food supplies are coming from Great Britain. A lot of those food supplies, strangely enough, are coming from up north. A farmer from up north will sell his excess crops to a broker who will then have those crops transported across the state on a railroad, loaded onto a ship, and sailed to Nassau and sold to a Confederate agent, usually for cotton, in exchange for cotton. And the strangest thing is, everybody knew about that, and Grant even complained about that at one point. After the port of Wilmington is closed, the Battle of Fort Fisher in February of 1865, there's really not any place left for the Confederates to get foodstuffs. The countryside has been ravaged by the war. The railroads are, for the most part, torn up, and Sherman's army will soon be leaving South Carolina and heading into North Carolina and wiping out those crops. Food is an important thing. It's really the thing that motivates most Confederate soldiers. I first became interested in this. I've always been interested in a lot of the other things that I've written, but there was a soldier from not too far where I live in Western North Carolina who was conscripted into the Confederate Army in 1862 and wrote a series of letters home. And his letters continually get worse and worse, basically saying that if the government does not start to feed us more, we are going to leave because we cannot eat. And I discovered quite a few other letters along those same lines. You can find copies of Feeding the Army of Northern Virginia at savisbeatty.com, or if you'd like a signed copy, you can visit my website, michaelchardy.com. Thank you very much.